Here is Pennonia Chestnut Brown, and Chestnut Brown is the perfect name for this, as you will see in the writing samples. A warm red mixed with a very dark blue, and something else I'm just having trouble IDing in the chromatography really combine beautifully. There is a noticeable tone shift as paper changes, but only if you have them in the side by side. And this is a gorgeous shader of an ink on the page. It just outstanding. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this can be aggressive, causing some feathering. Just choose the right paper if you are a student. Now, I love brown inks, and I really love this brown ink. I would be delighted to have a bottle of this, and if I had a bottle, I would enthusiastically use that bottle up.
The pen for today is a Sailor 1911 Large. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Chestnut brown indeed. Take a look at that beautiful color on the page. No feather, no spread, amazing shading. Really, what I'm looking at is like the word production or operation. Just look how the P is a nice midtone, dropping down in tone through most of the word. Very, very dark T at the end, looking outstanding. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Bubblegum. Here is Pennonia Golden Zold Pelican. Here is Pennonia Copper.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that in general, the tones are slightly lighter than they were on the Clairfontaine, but in general, everything we're seeing is within the range of tones that we had on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it still shades, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It still looks absolutely beautiful on the page. This is a story worth writing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, likely being affected by the yellow tone of the paper, showing that while this is a darker, beautiful brown, it is slightly translucent, not truly a problem. It does have feathering, which is much more of a problem. It does have a tiny bit of spread, which is still a problem. It does shade here, though. You can see it, especially like with together on the second line. But it's the feathering and the spread that would make me first want to avoid this on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see only, normal, not anything for ghosting, very deep into the paper, very regularly. I would not write on the back of this page for fear of corrupting both sets of notes, but none of these spots in this heavy into the page, none of it bled through to touch the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just about as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, does stand out against the quad rule with no problems at all. Once you use that quad rule to help guide in the writing or diagrams you make, it is disappeared into the background. This is a beautiful ink to use if this is the paper that you go for. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem for ghosting, but none of what I'm circling bled through to touch the page underneath, but the problem is how much it did this, how deep it got into the paper, how regularly, and it definitely was more noticeable in the print writing areas than it was in the cursive areas. Could you write back here? I believe that because it's such a dark ink that you would be able to get away with it without destroying both sides of notes. So yes, I think you could, but this aggression is just something to be aware of.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more brown inks. Here is Diatramentis El Greco Maroon. Here is Organic Studios Foggy Bottom Sepia. Here is Papier Plume Caramel.
Here is Tachia Yukiori Shikoru Karacha.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Very, very cool. Now, I'm going to say it's the same tone when we look at all that print writing and what's going on. It does get, in general, slightly lighter for the cursive writing that's happening. I think that lighter bit that's happening as a result of the paper, this does have a tendency to lighten up some of those tones. Otherwise, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade very well, incredibly well, really making the notes you take look even better, even smarter, probably giving you a boost in grade, standing out against the quad rule with no problems. Looking at the back of the page, it shows why this ink or this paper is so good for students, because there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Lamy Vibrant Pink. Here is Montegrappa Green. Here is Diamine Inferno Orange. Here is Noodler's 54th Massachusetts. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does have little bits of feathering that are going on. It does have quite a bit of spread that's happening. Now, the feathering and the spread are probably going to be reason enough for me to not use it, more that it's spreading more than I would really want going onto copy paper. But I think if you went for a very fine, very dry pen, this might work for you. Otherwise, I would stay away from this ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see that, you're not writing back here. This is not a great situation, though nothing bled through to touch the page underneath. The ghosting can be a little bit more significant, and it does get very deep into the page. Things that we should come to expect when looking at copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The wet zoom nib in the Sailor 1911 large gave a great tone and great shading. Off camera, I tried this in a dry medium pen, and the tones and shading were unaffected. This may be an almost perfect brown. You can ink it in any pen and enjoy it. This is no doubt a dealer's choice.